I ended up writing a client a check for $200,000 because I made a pretty big mistake. And that mistake, it was, we were, well, I want to preface this the right way. We were doing this project. It was a big renovation project, and it was essentially this evolving scope. By the time we finished the project, the project grew by 4 times the original contract value, and there was heightened frustrations because, frankly, we weren't even the only contractor on the job site. This was a job that we kind of took mainly because of the time in our career that we needed a project, and some unforeseen circumstances in the market that prevented us from continuing some other projects, whatever, blah, blah, blah. All that to be said is we were getting towards the end, and the client started getting very upset that the project wasn't done, but it was this evolving project, and actually threatened one of my guys and said that he was going to put us out of business. And, obviously my guy calls me and says, "Hey, this is what's going on." I'm like, what in the world are we talking about? We're there every day. Like, this place looks amazing. What is going on? And he essentially said that our contract stated one thing and we were doing another. Again, not really sure what we're talking about. I give him a call, and come to find out, we had been billing our billable rates for all of the labor on the job site, and in our contract, it didn't say anything about billable rates. So what that means is I was billing out someone, say, $75 an hour, which would be, anywhere from 75 to 100 is a market rate for a good carpenter in Boston. So we're billing our carpenters out at $75 to $100. But we didn't have that labor rate defined in our contract. So our contract is cost plus, means we can only bill the actual cost. So we got audited on this project, and they went through all of our financial records, which I just gave up. I was like, "Hey, I'm full transparent. I'm
not doing anything wrong."
Yeah, like here you go. Here's all the receipts, and they came back and they said that you've overcharged us $200,000, and we expect you to pay that back, or we will come after you. And I literally wrote them a check for 200 grand and sent it back to the client, and moved on.
So the problem, the discrepancy, between what you were charging, they were saying that $75 an hour isn't the cost of your employee. Like, you were paying them less than that.
Exactly. So they were like, your charge, like, you pay them, say it's $35 an hour, right? W-2. So then I went through and it was like, yeah, but here's the actual burdened rate. So we'll get to that in a second, but we were making a profit on the labor, as we should be. So of course I call my lawyer. I'm like, "Hey, what did we miss?" And he goes through our contract and he goes, "You need to have an exhibit in your contract that states the billable rate." And because since especially being that you're cost plus, so cost plus means you're charging the cost plus a predetermined percentage fee or predetermined fee, whether that's a dollar amount or fee. A percentage. But if you're going to charge a rate for something, you can charge a rate, but that needs to be defined in the contract.
Specifically or explicitly.
Yeah. So, whether that's labor or say you're charging an insurance fee, you can set a 2% insurance fee, but it needs to be defined in the contract and agreed upon. So we, from that point, we spent a couple $1,000s with our lawyer, rebuilt our contract, and now, we have exhibit in our contract that states every rate. It also states when those rates can change for fluctuation. So you have a multi-year job, like the rates can go up, et cetera, et cetera. But in this exercise, I realized, I wonder if I'm actually accurate in terms of what this employee costs.
So before we get to that, Can we take a step back? How could we have avoided this? There's the exhibit, right, where you have a billable rate or a market rate, or not a market, but like a billable rate. Or I guess you could have had your cost plus, but then you would have had to had within your contract or within your invoicing cost for all of the cost associated with that employee, right? So you would have had to have either a percentage or an hourly cost for payroll taxes, workers' comp, general liability, all that stuff. So that's the other way that you could have avoided this. You didn't have either. You were charging a billable or a market rate, and they were basically saying, well, this isn't the actual cost because you didn't spell out that there were costs above and beyond just what what you're paying them.
Yeah. Right. So, that project goes, we learn from it, and we dig in real hard on, all right, what's the true cost of this labor? And I want to say something, like high level. If you're self-performing labor, you should be making a profit on that. And I'll give you an example before we dig into like the specifics of burden. But I had a client after this, like after that client, a couple of years later, say, hey, are you charging me a labor rate that includes profit for your labor, and then you're getting your cost plus on top of that? And I said, I am. And the client said, that's double dipping. I said, well, I don't really love that term, but I guess if you want to look at it that way. And she said, well, I don't want to pay a markup on a markup. I said, no problem. I said, what we can do is, and rather than use our in-house labor, I'll sub everything out. And she said, well, what do you mean? I'm like, I'll just sub it all out. The market rate for a carpenter is $75. So I'll just sub it out. That way, when I transfer it over to you, you're paying the exact same price, but at least I'm not making additional profit. And she smirked and she said, well, that doesn't change anything. I said, right. I said, the additional profit.
And that's because when a subcontractor gives you a number that you are paying them, they have profit in it for themselves.
Right.
And then you're having your company profit on top of that.
Right. And
so that's like what essentially you're doing. Even with in-house labor, you still are accounting for your profit, but then you have your plus on top of that.
Right. And as you should, because if you have in-house labor, there's costs that go into keeping those guys in-house. It's everything that goes above and beyond, training them, the culture, the work parties, the work events, the bonuses. There's, and just then, that's the overhead associated with it that doesn't necessarily always get captured in the rate, but then the profit. You're taking the risk of having employees. You're like, that is a risk that you're incurring, so you should be profiting for that. And so the client ultimately was like, well, that doesn't make sense. I'd rather work with your guys. I said, the price is the same either way.
Yeah.
You're going to get, you know what you're going to get with my guys. We're a company, with the company culture. And she was like, okay, understood. That makes sense to me. And it never had an issue beyond that. But we went into this kind of, we literally printed out a year's worth of transactions, thousands of line items, and just went through and basically said, is this associated with, we did two exercises. This is when we really started digging into the cost of running a job versus running the business, and basically like said, if we had no projects going on, would we have this cost? And if the answer was no, then it was a job cost and we made sure we were billing for it. But we did the same thing for labor. And we just kept going through line by line and highlighting things that were associated directly with an employee. So, obviously payroll tax, 401k contribution, health insurance, dental, vision, all of that stuff is kind of pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
But then it was the vehicle. And so then we built out this spreadsheet that, okay, well, how much is the vehicle? What's the monthly payment on that vehicle? What's the insurance rate for that vehicle? How much are you spending in fuel per month? And we basically built all this stuff out on a monthly cost. And that way we'd have a monthly cost, and then we could divide it down to week, day, and per hour. But as we continue to do it, and we look at this thing every 6 months. As we continue to do it, we kept finding things. So I'm going to pull it up because I just want to make sure I don't miss it.
Do you have different burden rates for different types of employees, or are you averaging that for all employees?
Different rates. Different rates for
different roles. Yeah.
And I'm going to explain, and there can be a swing in what our markup is. I'll get to that. But so just going down the list, we have cell phone. Like, are we paying for their cell phone? Their vehicle? Are we giving them an allowance, or do they get a company vehicle? How does that break down? Software. So we found that about $1 per hour is what it costs us for the software stack that each of these employees have. And that's, their project management platform license, Adobe license, Bluebeam license, the $8 a month I pay for their custom email, an amortized cost for their laptop, iPad, so on and so forth. Workers' comp, based on what their role is, their workers' comp is different. A super versus a carpenter versus, office, their workers' comp rate changes.
Yeah.
And same thing with general liability. Their general liability changes based on that role. So then we have this direct cost, which, we understand, this employee, just for example, like, hey, this guy makes, we pay him $24 an hour. All right, that actually costs the company so far $30 an hour. And then we factor things in like how many company holidays are they? How much PTO do they get per year? And then we make sure that we understand the PTO cost. So that $30 just turned into $35. And then we look at, okay, now what's the market rate for that particular role? So market rate for that role would be anywhere from like $50 to $65 an hour. So we'll just call it 65. You're making $30 an hour on this role. As they start making $26, $28, $30, say the role that they fill ranges from 25 to 30, our billable rate doesn't change.
Yeah.
And the reason we felt comfortable with that is essentially if you're on the low end of that rate of that role, you're going to make more mistakes and the company's going to be paying for more, basically paying more to fix things or paying for your inefficiencies. You get paid more based on less mistakes, higher efficiency. So, we're not necessarily tracking the inefficiencies, but in theory, the person that's making on the low range is going to make more mistakes, so that margin is larger. So we're capturing those inefficiencies in that larger margin. And as you get to the top end of that rate, that margin is smaller, but you're essentially dipping into it less for mistakes.